crowd at the county horse auction murmured in disinterest as the next horse was led into the ring. It was a stark contrast to the typical glamour of horse sales, where animals with smooth coats, proud gaits, and perfectly matched pedigrees were the stars of the show. This horse, however, was anything but that. The animal limped heavily, its rear right leg clearly causing it pain. Its coat, once a deep chestnut, was now dusty and patchy, the result of neglect and hard times. It was thin, too thin, with ribs showing, and its eyes, those eyes, told a story of exhaustion, abandonment, and something else. Something deeper. A few people scoffed, turning their heads away in contempt. One man shook his head. "Poor thing, doesn't even look like it'll last another week." Others laughed, making jokes that echoed across the wooden walls of the barn. "Guess it'll be more glue than gallop." The auctioneer, a man with a slick voice, but no real care for the horses he sold, paused for just a moment, as if even he couldn't quite bring himself to get excited about the next lot. "All right, next up, number 61. Gayling, 6 years old. No papers, no pedigree, starting bid at $1, he called into the microphone, his voice loud but devoid of enthusiasm. The crowd's reaction was immediate. A ripple of laughter, a few chuckles. No one raised a hand. At the back of the ring, an old man stood silently. His eyes, however, were fixed on the horse. Elijah Creed, a rugged figure in his mid-50s, stood alone in the shadows. His sun-bleached hat shaded his face, but even if it hadn't, the lines of age and hardship would have been obvious to anyone paying attention. His boots, caked in dried mud, spoke of long hours spent on the land. His clothes, worn but sturdy, told the story of a man who'd worked harder than most, but had lost more than most could imagine. Elijah's ranch had once been a thriving enterprise. He had worked with horses for decades, raising and training them, gaining a reputation for his quiet yet effective methods. But that was years ago. The ranch had fallen into ruin, sold off bit by bit after his son Luke had disappeared without a word 12 years ago. Elijah's life had become a cycle of work and silence. But the horse in front of him, that horse, there was something in its eyes. Elijah didn't hesitate. His hand slowly rose, fingers curling into the air. $1, he said, his voice steady, as if the entire world were listening to his bid. The auctioneer squinted in disbelief. "We got a bid for $1. Do I hear two?" His voice was as empty as the bids that had followed. Silence. Going once, going twice. The gavel fell with a sharp, hollow sound. "Sold to the gentleman in the back," the auctioneer said, his voice betraying his indifference. Elijah made his way through the crowd, the whispers following him. He ignored them, focused only on the horse. He approached the gate where a young wrangler stood, leading the animal toward him. The horse flinched, its limp making it move slower, but Elijah remained calm. He didn't need to hurry. The young man handed over the lead rope without a word, and Elijah nodded, his hands gentle but firm as he took the reins. The horse's eyes flickered to him, wary but not afraid. It was as if the creature already recognized the unspoken promise of care and safety. "I'm going to call you Dusty," Elijah murmured, more to himself than to the horse, "because that's what you were when I found you." The animal didn't resist. It simply followed him as he led it away from the auction ring, each step echoing on the gravel. As they made their way to Elijah's rusted trailer, a few people turned to look. Some muttered under their breath, "Should have paid him to take it. That horse will be dead in a month, mark my words." Elijah didn't respond. He knew they didn't understand. They couldn't understand. When they reached the trailer, he opened the gate. The horse paused for just a moment, hesitant before stepping in. Elijah followed, closing the gate behind him and walking around to the front of the vehicle. His boots scraped against the gravel as the truck's engine roared to life, pulling them out of the auction lot and into the empty landscape beyond. The drive to Elijah's ranch was a slow one. The fields stretched out on either side, golden and brown, dotted with half-collapsed fences and barns that had long since fallen into disrepair. Elijah's land, once lush and full of life, was now a shadow of what it used to be. Only a few acres remained under his ownership, and most of the barns were boarded up, the roofs sagging like tired men waiting for rest. The ranch was a shell of its former self, much like Elijah. The truck rattled along the bumpy road for about an hour before pulling up to the lone stable still standing. Elijah stopped the truck and stepped out, stretching his back. He opened the trailer and walked around to the horse, now quietly standing, waiting. "Come on, Dusty," Elijah murmured. The horse stepped out slowly, its limp more pronounced now that it was walking on solid ground. Elijah led it to a stall and set out fresh straw for it to lay in. He filled a bucket with water, setting it beside the horse, but he didn't rush. "No rush," Elijah said softly, glancing up at the sky. The stars were beginning to blink into existence, the night wrapping itself around the ranch. "You've got time now." That night, Elijah sat on the porch of the house, sipping weak coffee. The sound of the wind whistling through the empty fields was the only noise breaking the silence. Dusty shifted in the stall, his breath soft in the cool air, but otherwise the ranch was quiet. Elijah hadn't planned on buying a horse that day. It wasn't something he had intended, but something had called to him when he saw Dusty. The horse's eyes, tired and beaten, reminded him of the Mustang he had once trained, Cypress. Cypress had been a wild, untamable spirit. Elijah had spent years building a bond with him. Together, they had ridden across the plains, side by side, never needing words to understand one another. But Cypress had died 5 years ago, the same year Luke disappeared. It was as if the two events were linked, Cypress's death and Luke's absence. For years, Elijah hadn't trained another horse. He hadn't wanted to. The stable had remained empty, and the silence between him and the world had grown heavier with each passing year. But when he saw Dusty at the auction, something stirred in him. Not pity, not a desire to fix the broken. No, it was something else, something deeper. Elijah rose from the porch and made his way back to the stable. He stood in the doorway, watching the horse carefully. Dusty wasn't wild, not like Cypress, but there was a quiet strength in him, an unspoken resilience that Elijah understood. He could see the potential there. The healing would take time, for both of them. "I'm going to give you a chance, Dusty," Elijah whispered, the words barely more than a breath. "And I'm going to give myself one too." The night passed, and the ranch grew still once more. But something had changed. A small spark of hope flickered to life in Elijah's chest. He didn't know if it was for Dusty or for himself, but it was there. And for the first time in years, Elijah believed there was a possibility of redemption, for the horse, and maybe, just maybe, for him too. The morning light broke gently over the horizon, casting long shadows across the empty fields. Elijah sat on the porch, his cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. Dusty had settled into his new home the night before, his movements still stiff but less hesitant than when Elijah first brought him in. The horse had slept through most of the night, shifting occasionally but never fully at ease. Elijah's eyes tracked the slow movement of the sun rising higher in the sky. His mind, though, wandered elsewhere, as it often did, to the past, to Luke. He hadn't expected to see the familiar face of his son, let alone hear his voice again after 12 long years. Yet there Luke was, standing at the edge of the ranch, more worn than Elijah remembered, but still unmistakably his son. The silence between them was thick, filled with unspoken years and unresolved pain. Elijah hadn't known how to bridge the gap, nor if he could. But the presence of Dusty seemed to stir something else within him, something that hadn't been present for a long time, the quiet promise of redemption, both for the horse and for himself. As the days passed, Elijah stuck to his routine. He fed Dusty twice a day, made sure the horse had fresh water, and tended to the small things on the ranch that had been neglected for so long. It was hard to see past the years of broken fences and collapsed barns, but little by little, Elijah began to take action. He started mending the fences around the property, using the same steady hands that had once built the ranch from the ground up. Mornings were spent in the stables with Dusty, gently brushing the horse's coat, massaging his sore muscles, and working with him on simple commands. The horse was wary at first, flinching at every touch, as if expecting pain. But Elijah didn't rush. He understood that trust couldn't be rushed. "Elijah, you're wasting your time." The familiar voice caught him off guard. Maggie, his neighbor, stood by the gate to the stable, arms crossed over her chest, her expression stern but not unkind. Maggie had always been one of the few people who kept an eye on Elijah, even when he preferred to stay hidden from the world. A rancher in her own right, Maggie had never been afraid to speak her mind. "I'm not wasting my time," Elijah replied quietly, his voice steady as he ran a brush over Dusty's back. "I'm giving him the time he needs." Maggie's gaze lingered on Dusty, taking in the horse's weak, stumbling gait and the still apparent limp. "You're wasting your time, Elijah. That horse has no business being here. He's a lost cause." Elijah didn't look up. His focus was entirely on Dusty, who had begun to nudge Elijah's hand with his nose, seeking attention. A quiet sigh escaped Elijah's lips as he continued grooming the horse. "He's not a lost cause," Elijah said softly. "I see something in him, something I haven't seen in a long time." Maggie sighed, her shoulders slumping in defeat. She'd known Elijah long enough to understand that once he had his mind set on something, it was nearly impossible to change it. But that didn't mean she couldn't try. "Elijah, I'm not saying you're wrong," she said, her voice softening. "But look at him. He's hurt, old, and broken. What are you going to do with him? He's not Cypress." Elijah flinched at the mention of Cypress, the horse he had lost so many years ago. The pain of that loss was still raw, even after all this time. Cypress had been more than a horse. He had been a companion, a partner, a living reminder of the good times Elijah had shared with his son, Luke. "I know he's not Cypress," Elijah replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But I can't just let him go. He deserves more than this." Maggie hesitated before speaking again. "You're doing this for you, aren't you? This isn't about the horse anymore. It's about fixing what's broken inside of you." Elijah was quiet for a long moment, the words sinking in. He couldn't deny it. The pain of losing his ranch, losing his son, he had buried those feelings deep, and Dusty's arrival had opened up a well of emotions he hadn't been prepared to confront. But he didn't want to admit it to Maggie. She was right, in a way. This was about healing. "Maybe," he muttered, "but that doesn't mean he doesn't deserve a chance." Maggie seemed to accept his response, though the skepticism didn't fully leave her eyes. "All right, then," she said after a moment, "but don't say I didn't warn you." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Elijah to continue his work in silence. It was the kind of quiet that was both comforting and lonely. Elijah didn't mind it. He wasn't sure if he was ready for company just yet, especially not from someone like Maggie, who could see right through him. Over the next few days, Dusty's condition improved. The horse's limp grew less pronounced, and the vacant look in his eyes began to fade, replaced by something more focused, more aware. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Elijah to feel a flicker of hope. Elijah worked tirelessly alongside Dusty. He fed him, brushed him, walked him around the small pasture behind the barn. Each small victory, the horse taking a few more steps without wincing, the way he started standing straighter, felt like a triumph. Elijah wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't trying to rush the healing. With Dusty, there was no deadline. He was in no position to expect anything from the horse. But there were moments, fleeting moments, where Elijah could swear that Dusty was beginning to trust him. When Elijah reached for the horse's mane, Dusty no longer pulled away. When Elijah spoke to him, his ears would flick forward, listening. For the first time in years, Elijah didn't feel so alone. One afternoon, after a particularly peaceful morning working with Dusty, Elijah sat on the porch, watching the sun dip lower in the sky. His hand, rough and weathered from years of hard work, rested on his knee. It felt good, the steady rhythm of work, the quiet presence of the horse, and even Maggie's criticisms. Everything seemed to be falling into place, slowly but surely. The wind rustled through the dry grass, carrying the scent of the land with it. Elijah didn't notice the time passing. He didn't care. The past felt distant, as if it had happened to someone else. And for the first time in a long while, the future didn't seem as empty. Dusty was still in the stall, but Elijah knew that the next step was coming soon. He could feel it in his bones. It was time to take the horse out into the round pen. Elijah had been waiting for the right moment. He needed Dusty to be ready, not just physically, but emotionally. Elijah? The voice broke through his thoughts, and he turned to see Luke standing in the doorway. The same tall, lean figure, but with a new air about him. He looked tired but grounded. Elijah felt his chest tighten, but he said nothing. Luke took a few steps forward, eyes flicking toward Dusty in the stall. "How's he doing?" Elijah hesitated, unsure of how to respond. It had been a long time since they had spoken about anything real. Luke's presence had always been a ghost, lingering in the spaces between words. "He's doing well," Elijah said softly. "Better than I expected." Luke nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "You've been working with him?" "Yeah," Elijah replied, his voice tight. "Thought I might try training him." Luke didn't say anything right away. He stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the horse. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Luke broke the silence. "You think he's ready?" Elijah stood slowly, his hand brushing against the railing of the porch. "Not yet," he said quietly, "but he's getting there." Luke nodded again, stepping back. "Good," he said, voice soft. "I'll help you with him, if you want." Elijah didn't know what to say to that. A part of him was wary, skeptical, but another part of him felt a spark of something else. Hope? Maybe? "All right," Elijah said, his voice low. "Let's see what he's made of." The sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows over the fields, as Elijah and Luke stood side by the corral. Dusty, now stronger and more confident, trotted around the perimeter of the pen, his steps sure and steady. The horse had come a long way since Elijah first brought him home from the auction, but there was still more work to be done. Elijah wiped his brow with the back of his hand, glancing over at Luke, who was leaning against the fence, arms folded. The past few days had been an uneasy mix of silence and small, tentative steps toward reconnecting. Elijah wasn't sure what to expect from this strange, quiet version of his son. Luke had returned, but he was different, hardened by years away from the ranch, from the life Elijah had known. Think he's ready? Luke asked, his voice calm but with an edge of doubt. Elijah watched Dusty carefully, noting the way the horse's muscles rippled as he moved. There was still a faint limp, but it had become barely noticeable. The once fragile creature was now gaining strength with each passing day. "He's ready enough," Elijah answered, his voice low, but there was a quiet confidence in it. "We've made it this far, haven't we?" Luke's eyes flicked to the horse, his lips pressed into a tight line. "Yeah, but you think he's ready for more than just walking around the pen?" Elijah felt the familiar weight of the past press down on him. He wasn't just training Dusty anymore, he was facing something more. There was a need to prove something, not just to Luke or to Maggie or to the others who had written him off. He had to prove it to himself. "I think he can do more," Elijah said after a long pause, his eyes not leaving the horse. "But it's not just about the horse, it's about trust. The way I trust him and the way he trusts me." Luke shifted slightly, his gaze still on the horse. "You're still thinking about Cypress, aren't you?" The mention of the old Mustang, Cypress, hit Elijah like a fist to the gut. The horse had been his closest companion, his partner in every sense. But Cypress had died years ago, just after Luke left, and Elijah hadn't been the same since. The emptiness that had filled him when Cypress passed was a wound that never quite healed. He sighed deeply, pushing the painful memory aside. "Maybe, but this is different. Dusty's got his own story, his own way of doing things." Luke didn't respond right away, and the air between them grew thick with unspoken words. Elijah had always known there were things he and Luke needed to talk about, things they hadn't said to each other in 12 years. "Look," Luke said, breaking the silence, "I came back because I had to. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I think I owe it to you to help with this. With Dusty." Elijah turned toward his son, his heart tightening. He could see the sincerity in Luke's eyes, the hesitation that still lingered. They had never really talked about why Luke left or what happened in the years between. The distance between them was as much emotional as physical, and it had been long enough that neither of them knew where to begin. "All right," Elijah said after a long moment, his voice steady. "Let's see what he can do." Luke nodded and walked over to the gate, opening it slowly, his movements deliberate. He stepped into the pen, the dust rising around him as he approached Dusty. The horse stopped, his ears flicking forward, watching Luke with an intensity that seemed to say he was ready for whatever came next. Luke held out his hand, and Dusty took a step forward, hesitating for just a moment before nuzzling his fingers. Elijah watched, his breath held, as Dusty stood still, allowing Luke to stroke his mane. "All right," Luke murmured, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Let's see how well we've been working together." Elijah stood at the edge of the pen, arms crossed, his heart racing as Luke mounted Dusty. The horse shifted beneath him, but didn't buck or resist. Dusty was calm, his head low as if he trusted Luke more than he trusted anyone else in that moment. Luke urged Dusty forward, and the two moved in a slow circle around the pen. There was no tension, no sudden jerks or struggles. The movements were fluid, a dance of quiet coordination. It was a good sign. But as the day wore on, the air shifted. A storm was coming, both in the skies and in the emotions Elijah had kept buried for so long. They had made progress with Dusty, but there was still a lot to work through, especially between father and son. Luke guided Dusty through a series of obstacles, his commands calm and steady. The horse responded well, but there was still something missing. Dusty had learned to trust, but Luke hadn't fully let go of the past. Elijah could see it in the way his son's shoulders tensed when the horse stumbled, or when the silence between them stretched too long. Elijah could feel the pull of his own memories, of the days spent with Cypress, training together in silence, understanding each other without words. He'd once hoped Luke and he could share that kind of bond, but somewhere along the way, that hope had faded. Now, watching his son work with Dusty, Elijah wondered if they could ever find that kind of connection again. The storm clouds gathered overhead, casting a dark shadow over the ranch. The wind began to pick up, and Elijah felt the tension in the air. "We're done for today," Luke said, his voice breaking through Elijah's thoughts. "It's getting too late, and this storm's coming in fast." Elijah nodded, but he didn't speak. He watched as Luke dismounted, leading Dusty back toward the barn. The rain began to fall in heavy sheets just as they reached the stable, the sound of it drowning out the last of the day's noise. Elijah stood in the doorway, watching his son care for the horse, his hands gentle as he rubbed Dusty's coat, making sure the horse was comfortable. Elijah's heart clenched. He had hoped for so much more from this moment, but it felt like they were still a long way from where they needed to be. When Luke finished, he stepped back, wiping the sweat from his brow, his face grim. "We'll try again tomorrow," he said, not meeting Elijah's eyes. "Yeah," Elijah replied quietly. Tomorrow. The air was thick with anticipation as Elijah and Luke stood outside the barn the morning of the local competition. Dusty, his coat gleaming in the early sunlight, stood still, his head held high. He had come a long way since Elijah had first brought him home, the broken-down horse from the auction now becoming something more, stronger, healthier, and perhaps most importantly, trusted. But today wasn't just about Dusty proving his worth. It was about something bigger, a chance for Elijah and Luke to prove something to themselves, to bridge the distance between them that had lingered for over a decade. They hadn't discussed it, but both knew the stakes of the competition weren't just about the horse. The old wounds between them, buried for so long, felt raw again, and the tension between father and son was thick. Luke had been quiet ever since the previous day. It had been a long day of training, their second attempt to work in sync with Dusty. Though the horse had responded well, there had been moments of hesitation between them, moments when Elijah could see that Luke was holding back. It was as if his son was afraid to fully commit, to give everything he had. Perhaps it was the fear of failure or the weight of the past, but Elijah couldn't ignore it. "This is it, Luke," Elijah said quietly, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of concern. "You ready?" Luke didn't meet his eyes immediately. He was busy adjusting Dusty's saddle, his face set in concentration. He ran his hand along the horse's back, checking the cinch, the stirrups, and the reins. "Yeah," Luke said, his voice almost too low to hear. "I'm ready." The two of them stood in silence for a moment, the quiet of the morning punctuated only by the distant sound of birds and the wind rustling through the trees. Elijah's eyes lingered on Dusty, who stood patiently in front of them, as if he too understood the importance of the day. He knew his part in this, a chance to show the world that he was more than a broken, discarded creature. "Let's get this over with," Elijah muttered, shaking his head, as if the words themselves would break the tension in his chest. Luke finally looked up, meeting Elijah's gaze. "You're not doing this for the ribbon, right?" Elijah felt a moment of warmth inside him, a small crack in the ice that had built up between them. "No, not the ribbon," he said, "but maybe it's time to show people, show ourselves, that we've still got something left." Luke nodded but didn't say anything more. They both knew what he meant. This wasn't just about winning, it was about redemption. For Dusty, for Elijah, and for the years lost between him and his father. The competition was held in a dusty arena at the far end of the county, a small event attended by local ranchers, families, and a few outsiders hoping to make a name for themselves. The usual cast of competitors lined the stands, each horse and rider familiar faces to Elijah. Some were young cowboys eager to make their mark, while others were older, seasoned veterans who had seen more years on the ranch than Elijah cared to count. Elijah and Luke stood at the edge of the arena, watching the other contestants warm up. The air was thick with the smell of horses and hay, the faintest sound of hooves scraping against the dirt. Dust swirled in the hot afternoon sun, and Elijah could feel the tension building with every passing second. "We'll do fine," Luke muttered, almost to himself. "Just keep your head, son," Elijah replied, his eyes on the riders. "We've trained for this." Luke mounted Dusty with smooth precision, the horse standing perfectly still, his eyes calm. The audience murmured, noticing the unlikely pair, the broken-down horse and the son who had been gone for so long. The ringmaster called for attention, announcing the start of the competition. Luke and Dusty moved into the arena, their presence commanding attention. The other riders glanced over, sizing up their competition, but the eyes of the crowd seemed to settle on them more than anyone else. There was something about Dusty, something that drew the gaze, something that promised a story behind him. Elijah's heart swelled with pride as his son guided the horse through the first few obstacles. The course was set up to mimic the challenges of ranch life: gates to open, barrels to maneuver, a small bridge to cross, and a final sprint to the finish line. It was the kind of course that tested not just the skill of the horse, but also the bond between rider and mount. Elijah stood at the edge of the ring, watching with a mixture of awe and anxiety. He could see Luke's determination, but he could also see the hesitation, the way his son would momentarily glance toward him, searching for something. Perhaps it was approval, or perhaps it was a sign that Luke still wasn't sure if he was ready to fully let go of the past. But there was no time for that now. Luke guided Dusty to the first obstacle, a gate that needed to be opened with a quick, efficient move. Dusty stopped in front of it, his ears flicking, eyes calm but alert. The crowd held its breath as Luke dismounted, unlatched the gate, and led Dusty through. The move was smooth, almost effortless. Elijah's heart skipped a beat. "Good boy," Elijah murmured under his breath. The next obstacle was a series of barrels, set in a tight line. Luke and Dusty navigated the course with surprising speed, weaving in and out without touching a single barrel. The horse's body moved with the grace of a dancer, and the bond between him and Luke was unmistakable. But then came the bridge. Dusty hesitated as he approached the wooden slats, the sound of hooves on the dry wood making him uneasy. Elijah held his breath. This was the moment. If Dusty balked, it could all fall apart. Luke leaned forward, speaking softly to Dusty, his hand resting lightly on the reins. Slowly, Dusty placed one hoof on the bridge, testing it. He stepped forward, cautiously at first, but then with more confidence. The crowd exhaled as Dusty crossed the bridge, his pace steady. As they neared the final stretch of the course, the tension between father and son seemed to vanish. Dusty moved with purpose, his body now full of strength and grace. The finish line loomed ahead, but it was clear that this wasn't just a race. It was a statement of trust, of healing, and of redemption. When they crossed the finish line, the crowd erupted into applause. Elijah's heart pounded in his chest. They hadn't won first place, but in that moment it didn't matter. What mattered was that they had completed the course together. Dusty, the horse who had been discarded, was now a symbol of resilience. And Elijah and Luke, well, they were no longer just a father and son with a fractured past. They were partners, finally. Luke dismounted, leading Dusty back toward the exit. As Elijah walked up to meet them, he could see the quiet satisfaction in Luke's eyes. "You did it," Elijah said, his voice thick with emotion. Luke looked at him, and for the first time in years, their eyes met with something more than distance. "We did it," Luke replied. The sun dipped low over the mountains, casting long golden shadows across the ranch. Elijah stood at the edge of the fence, his hand resting lightly on the post. His eyes were focused on the land in front of him, but his mind wandered back to the events of the last few weeks. The competition had been a turning point, a sign that the years of struggle, silence, and heartbreak were slowly giving way to something new, something he hadn't expected to find: hope. Luke had stayed. The evening after the competition, when the last of the trucks had left the fairgrounds, Luke had said it, quietly, but with conviction. He wasn't leaving again. He was staying, not just for the ranch, but for something more. And Elijah? He hadn't known it then, but he'd been waiting for this moment too, as if he had been holding his breath for 12 years. The sounds of horses grazing and the distant clink of tools on metal filled the air as Elijah watched Luke work in the pasture. The younger man moved with a confidence Elijah hadn't seen in him in years. There was something about Luke's presence that seemed to fill the space between them, a space that had once been cold and empty, now slowly warming with each passing day. Elijah had spent the morning fixing the fence that ran along the south pasture, a job that had been neglected for far too long. He had always hated repairing fences, more so after the ranch had fallen into disrepair, but today it felt different. Each post he hammered into the ground, each board he tightened, felt like a piece of something new being built. Not just the ranch, but the relationship with his son. Luke had been helping, though he worked in silence, as if still sorting through the thoughts that weighed on him. Elijah had never been good at expressing his feelings, and Luke was no better. Yet, there was an understanding between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that things were changing, slowly but surely. The past was still there, hanging between them like a shadow, but it wasn't so suffocating anymore. "Need some help?" Luke's voice broke through the quiet as he walked up beside Elijah, wiping his hands on his jeans. His gaze was steady, but there was something soft in his eyes, something that Elijah hadn't seen in a long time. Elijah looked up, meeting his son's eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, without thinking, Elijah nodded. Sure, why not? They worked together in the silence that had come to feel comfortable. It was nothing like the old days when every moment had been filled with words, and every glance had carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken resentments. Now, there was peace between them. No grand gestures, no apologies. They were simply two men working side by side, each one understanding the other in ways they hadn't before. By the time the sun had begun to set, the fence was finished. It wasn't perfect, but it was solid, sturdy, and that was enough. Later that evening, as they sat on the porch, sipping coffee in the cool evening air, Elijah couldn't help but reflect on everything that had changed. The ranch was still a shadow of its former self, but it was no longer just a symbol of failure. It was a place of new beginnings. Luke had been working with Dusty every day, and Elijah could see the horse's progress in his son's eyes. Dusty was no longer the broken creature Elijah had bought at the auction. He was strong, confident, and capable. And in a strange way, Dusty had become a symbol of their own journey, a journey of healing, of trust, and of redemption. "You know," Luke said, breaking the silence, "I've been thinking about what you said about opening the ranch to others, about giving horses like Dusty a chance." Elijah turned toward him, surprised by the sudden shift in conversation. What about it? I think it's a good idea, Luke continued. We've got the space, the skills. We could make it work. Maybe not right away, but it could be something real. Something more than just fixing fences. Elijah stared at him for a moment, his mind racing. The idea had been floating around for a while, but hearing it from Luke made it feel different, real, even. Maybe it was time to stop living in the past and start building something new, not just for them, but for others too. You really think so? Elijah asked quietly. Luke nodded. Yeah, I do. There was a long pause as they both sat there, letting the idea settle. Elijah's heart swelled with a quiet pride. This wasn't just about a new venture. This was about something deeper. This was about healing old wounds and giving back to the land that had given so much to them both. It was about taking what they had learned, the pain, the loss, and using it to create something lasting. All right, Elijah said at last, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Let's start making it happen. The following days were a whirlwind of planning and preparation. Luke took the lead, handling the logistics while Elijah focused on the ranch's needs. They started clearing out the old barns, making space for new arrivals, and designing a program for training and rehabilitation. Maggie, the tough neighboring rancher, had been skeptical at first, but when she saw the work they were putting in, she offered her help. She had always been a practical woman, and Elijah knew that her expertise would be invaluable. But it wasn't just about the horses. It was about the people they would bring in. The ones who needed help, the ones who had nowhere else to turn. Elijah had never been one for grand plans, but this felt different. This felt like something that could give the ranch a purpose again. Over the next few weeks, the place began to change. The barns were rebuilt, fences repaired, and new horses arrived, each one with its own story, its own scars. Some were wild, others had been abused or abandoned, but each one found something here, a second chance. Dusty, who had become the symbol of their redemption, took on a new role. He became the lead horse in the rehabilitation program, guiding the others with his calm demeanor and steady presence. Elijah watched him with a sense of pride that was hard to put into words. It was a reminder that the journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. One evening, after a long day of work, Elijah found Luke sitting on the porch, watching the sunset behind the hills. The ranch had never looked more alive, and for the first time in years Elijah felt a sense of peace. We've come a long way, Luke said quietly. Elijah nodded. Yeah, we have. The two of them sat in comfortable silence as the night crept in, the sounds of the ranch settling around them. It wasn't perfect. There would always be challenges, obstacles to overcome. But for the first time in a long time, Elijah knew that the future held promise. Together, they had built something lasting, a place of healing, not just for the horses, but for themselves. And as Dusty grazed peacefully in the pasture, Elijah couldn't help but smile. They had done it. They had found redemption, not in a ribbon or a competition, but in each other,